The cotton industry and the slave trade have been closely related throughout history. In fact, it is believed that the cotton industry could not have existed without the cruel practice of slavery. The cotton industry helped strengthen and expand the slave trade. And the slave trade was crucial for providing the workforce necessary for the cotton industry to thrive. In today's episode of Stolen History, we are going to look at the close relationship between the cotton industry and the slave trade and how they grew together during the modern era. We will look at how the cotton industry led to the intensification of the slave trade and how the slave trade supplied the labor force for the cotton industry. If you like to watch episodes like this one, please subscribe so that you don't miss out on future uploads. Cotton was one of the most important cash crops produced by slave labor in the pre-industrial era. Cotton cultivation and harvesting relied primarily on the forced labor of slaves, particularly in the southern United States and America in general, and in American colonies such as St. Domingue and other markets. However, even with the abundance of slaves in these areas, cotton production could not keep up with the rapidly growing demand in European textile centers. With the beginning of the Industrial Revolution and the invention of machines that mechanized the process of spinning cotton into cloth, the demand for raw cotton increased exponentially. By 1850, the United Kingdom had become the world's largest consumer of cotton, and the United States had become the world's largest producer. The first textile factories appeared in Great Britain in the mid-18th century. Soon after, they spread to other parts of Europe, notably Germany, France, and Belgium. These new machines dramatically increased the demand for raw cotton. The biggest beneficiaries of this change were the slave owners because it meant that the demand for cotton was no longer limited to local markets or export markets that were just across the ocean. Now there was a huge market for cotton in Europe. This new market created a lot of opportunities for slave owners who wanted to make a profit from selling their product. The main thing that they needed now was to find a way to mass-produce cotton. They could not rely on small farms that used free labor. So they started buying up large tracts of land in the South where they would grow cotton using slave labor. One of the first things that these planters did was to buy slaves. Many of them purchased slaves from other planters who were leaving the South to move to the cities. As the cities grew, more and more people left the countryside to go there to look for work. This made it difficult for planters to find enough workers to take care of their fields. So they started buying slaves from Africa. At first, they tried to get the Portuguese to do this for them, but the Portuguese refused because they had a monopoly on the slave trade in Africa. So planters had to go directly to Africa to buy slaves themselves. The British and French were also buying slaves in Africa, but they had a hard time competing with the Americans because the Americans were willing to pay more for slaves than they were. This was because the Americans knew that they could make more money from using slaves than the British and French could. By the end of the 18th century, the American colonies had acquired about 300,000 slaves from Africa. Most of these slaves were brought to the North American colonies, but some were also brought to the Caribbean islands and to South America. The majority of slaves were used on cotton plantations. This is because cotton was one of the most profitable crops that could be grown in the southern United States. Planters could earn a lot of money by selling cotton to European textile factories. But to make a profit from selling cotton, planters needed to grow it on a large scale. Small farms could not compete with large plantations because the cost of labor was too high. Therefore, slave owners began to buy up large tracts of land in the South where they could grow cotton using slave labor. The slave trade and the supply of slaves increased to provide the labor needed for the large cotton plantations. Millions of slaves were transported from Africa to the Americas to work in the fields. This massive slave trade fueled the growth of the cotton industry. The intensification of the slave trade led to the opening of new markets for enslaved people. Previously, only the Americas had participated in the slave trade. However, with the increase in demand for slaves, other regions also became involved in this cruel practice. One such region was Brazil. Brazil became an important destination for enslaved Africans, receiving a significant number of people who were transported across the Atlantic. Enslaved people were subjected to inhumane conditions during the crossing. and during overcrowded ships and horrific living conditions that resulted in high mortality rates. Upon arrival in Brazil, they faced further hardships as they were often sold at auctions where families were separated and individuals were forced to adapt to unfamiliar environments. The cotton trade had a profound impact on the increase in the slave trade during the modern era. It played a pivotal role in intensifying the transatlantic slave trade. The demand for cotton in Europe led to an increase in the scale and scope of the slave trade, resulting in the transportation of millions of enslaved Africans to the Americas. The triangular trade is a prime example of the impact of the cotton trade on the slave trade. This trade network connected Europe, Africa, and the Americas. European ships would carry manufactured goods to Africa, where they would exchange them for enslaved people. These enslaved individuals were then transported to the Americas, primarily to the United States and Brazil, where they were sold and the proceeds used to purchase more manufactured goods to sustain the trade. One of the key factors contributing to the intensification of the slave trade was the profitability and high demand for cotton. European textile industries heavily relied on cotton, and its use increased significantly due to the Industrial Revolution. The United States, with its vast land and abundance of slave labor, became the largest producer of cotton. This surge in demand for cotton led to the expansion of plantations and subsequently to the need for more slaves to work the fields. The United States and Brazil emerged as major players in the slave trade during this era. The United States, with its southern states heavily involved in cotton production, relied on slave labor to maintain its dominance in the cotton market. Brazil, on the other hand, had already established itself as a significant slave-owning society. Its economy was deeply rooted in the production of sugarcane and tobacco, and it continued to rely on enslaved labor to meet the demands of the international market. During the modern era, the cotton industry played a significant role in shaping the economic landscape and driving the expansion of the slave trade. The invention of the cotton gin further increased the demand for cotton, leading to the intensification of slavery and the expansion of plantations. The United States and Brazil became major participants in the slave trade, with the United States' southern states heavily reliant on slave labor for cotton production. Enslaved people were transported across the Atlantic Ocean under inhumane conditions and during overcrowded ships and harsh treatment. Upon arrival in the Americas, they faced the trauma of being sold at auctions where families were torn apart. The slave trade had a profound impact on African societies, causing immense suffering and the loss of millions of lives. Liverpool and Bristol in Britain became prominent centers of the slave trade. These ports played a vital role in the transportation of enslaved Africans to the Americas. The wealth generated through the slave trade contributed to the economic growth of Britain during the industrial era. The abolitionist movement gained momentum, with activists like William Wilberforce leading the charge to end the slave trade. The movement gained support and eventually led to the passing of the Slave Trade Act of 1807 in Britain, which outlawed the transportation of slaves. However, despite legal measures, slavery persisted in many parts of the world. The cotton industry profoundly impacted the slave trade, leading to its intensification and expansion during the modern era. The rise of textile factories in Europe created a surge in demand for cotton, which was abundantly supplied by the southern states of the United States. The need for labor-intensive cotton production led to the reliance on slave labor, fueling the transatlantic slave trade. Millions of enslaved Africans were transported across the Atlantic Ocean to work on cotton plantations in the United States and Brazil. Enduring horrific conditions and the trauma of being sold at auctions. The slave trade contributed significantly to the economic growth of nations like Britain, but it also caused immense suffering and the loss of countless lives in Africa. The abolitionist movement gained traction, eventually leading to the outlawing of the slave trade in 1807 in Britain. Despite the efforts to end slavery, it continued to persist in various forms until it was finally abolished in the 19th century. The legacy of slavery continues to have far-reaching consequences, and its impact is still felt today. The cotton industry during the modern era was characterized by a few key features. Firstly, it was heavily dependent on slave labor, which enabled the large-scale production of cotton. The invention of the cotton gin increased the efficiency of cotton processing. leading to higher productivity and greater profits for plantation owners. The cotton industry also had a significant impact on the global economy. Connecting the United States and Brazil to European markets, the demand for cotton in Europe, particularly for textile manufacturing, drove the expansion of plantations in the southern states of the United States and Brazil. Thank you for watching. See you next time.